Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. More than 100 people have been killed in Colombia after a 7.4 magnitude earthquake struck the western part of the country. The death toll is likely to rise as rescuers continue to search damaged buildings, while the country has declared a state of emergency. U.S. President Donald Trump is demanding that Iran pay compensation for all of the people that they have killed and wounded. This comes after Iran itself called for its own compensation for war damages, as well as an end to U.S. sanctions and military threats before the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Russia is preparing to deploy more North Korean troops, and that it has received additional ballistic missiles from Pyongyang. He also said Moscow could no longer sustain its war without support from North Korea. We begin this morning with a deadly earthquake in Colombia. Rescue workers are racing to reach people trapped beneath collapsed buildings after an earthquake struck the west of the country. The powerful tremor has killed more than 100 people and damaged hospitals, airports, and hundreds of homes. Our Oh Soo-young starts us off.
Colombia has declared a national state of emergency after its deadliest earthquake in a decade killed at least 111 people. The magnitude 7.4 quake struck the west of the country on Monday morning. Its epicenter was near San Jose del Palma in the remote Chocó region. At least 87 other people were injured, and around 1,600 buildings were damaged, including at least 61 that completely collapsed. Pereira and Cali were among the hardest hit cities, where residents joined rescuers searching for people beneath the rubble.
The damage is huge, lots of injured, definitely some deaths, I already know of some. Now we wait that those who can help, not only us, but the most vulnerable, should do it, because it is part of the humanism we all should have.
Hospitals and emergency facilities were damaged. Several airports also suspended operations for structural inspections. Communications were disrupted in the Chocó region, complicating efforts to assess the destruction and reach isolated communities.
I thought, well, let's wait for it to pass. But we saw that the magnitude was too strong. So we searched for a place where we knew was solid ground here in the square. I think that if it had lasted 5 more seconds, there wouldn't be anything left. I think we really reached the limit of resistance.
The earthquake was felt across Colombia and in neighboring Ecuador and Panama. At least 21 aftershocks were recorded by late Monday, with further tremors possible. Rescue teams are searching collapsed buildings as authorities warn the death toll could rise. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump is demanding compensation from Iran, adding a new condition to negotiations over reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The demand comes after Tehran issued its own call for war damages and a U.S. troop withdrawal. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
U.S. President Donald Trump on Monday demanded that Iran pay compensation for people he says were killed in wars, attacks, and protests, adding a new condition that could further complicate efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, they asked for reparations, you might say, or they asked for money for the damage that we've done. I said, that's a good idea. Well, we're going to ask for money for the damage they've done over a 50-year period. Whether you go SS Cole or whether you go all of the people that were so badly hurt, so badly wounded or killed, many thousands of people.
Trump's comments come after Iran's own calls for compensation and an end to U.S. sanctions. The issue emerged after negotiations between Iran and Oman over the weekend. Tehran said it would not agree to reopen the Strait of Hormuz unless Washington meets several conditions, including compensation for war damage and the withdrawal of U.S. troops. In a post on Truth Social on Monday, Trump also responded by saying Iran should instead compensate the families of Americans and others killed in conflicts and attacks linked to Tehran. He also called for payments to the families of what he described as innocent protesters killed by Iran's ruling regime over the past half-century. Trump said the compensation requirement will now be added to future negotiations. At least 18 U.S. service members have been killed in Middle East attacks connected to the U.S. war with Iran since the conflict began more than 5 months ago. Iran presented 6 conditions to the United States on Saturday, declaring that the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed until its demands are met. 이승재, Arirang News.
And the U.S. State Department says it has revoked more than 175,000 visas from foreign nationals under U.S. President Donald Trump's administration as Washington continues its sweeping immigration crackdown. The department says most revocations followed encounters with law enforcement, with assault, driving under the influence, theft, and drug offenses among the leading reasons. Officials say visas were also revoked from foreign nationals accused of serious crimes and immigration fraud, as well as those who threatened U.S. citizens or posed national security risks. In one example, a U.S. embassy in North Africa revoked more than 100 visas from so-called birth tourists, parents accused of traveling to the United States primarily to give birth so their children could obtain U.S. citizenship. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Russia is preparing to deploy more North Korean troops and has received additional ballistic missiles from Pyongyang. In a video address on Monday, Zelenskyy claimed Moscow could no longer sustain its war without North Korean support. A day earlier, he said as many as 50,000 North Korean troops could eventually be stationed in Russia, up from an earlier estimate of 30,000. Ukraine's military intelligence separately told Reuters that a roughly 90-member North Korean missile unit was deploying to Russia's Voronezh region. It could operate 6 launchers and up to 120 missiles. Neither Moscow nor Pyongyang have responded to the allegations. South Korea plans to enact a special law by the end of this year to support the government's 3 so-called mega projects aimed at strengthening competitiveness in semiconductor, physical AI, and AI data centers. And the enforcement decree of the country's Special Semiconductor Act will also take effect today to ease the financial burden on chip makers and speed up the development of semiconductor production facilities. For more on the domestic economy, we're joined today by Professor Kim Yong-jin, professor at Seogang Business School. Professor Kim, thanks for coming on today.
Good morning.
So how might these government's efforts speed up the development of semiconductor hubs change the chip manufacturing landscape in South Korea?
Well, as you mentioned, the newly enacted Special Semiconductor Act, which is called like the Special Act on Strengthening and Fostering the Competitiveness of the Semiconductor Industry, is a long name, but I did make it clear, right? It takes effect today. It will mark a fundamental paradigm shift for South Korea. It transitions the country's chip sector from private-led development into a state-backed all-out warfare systems. By legally binding the government to shoulder infrastructure cost and bypass administrative red tape, this law will drastically reshape the Korean chip manufacturing landscape in 4 major ways. First one is zero infrastructure financial burden for chip makers, which means that the government and local government will now cover 50% to 100% of the cost for critical infrastructure, including electricity, industrial water, and road. The second is the elimination of administrative red tape, is what is called timeout system. The third one is geographical expansion to nationwide, mega belt. I mean, it is now focusing on the capital area, but we're moving toward, locals. And finally, the fortifying the local supply chain, including sub-materials and equipment, massive financial ecosystem, and joint R&D infrastructure. This law is expected to level the playing field against the U.S. CHIPS Act and Taiwan's aggressive state protectionism. In South Korea, chip makers are no longer fighting global subsidy wars alone. And they now have the full financial and legal backing of the state to, build world, densest, fastest growing semiconductor production ecosystem.
Right, and I also want to ask you about the tax reform plan that the government recently unveiled, and that's aimed at expanding tax benefits for owner-occupied homes while imposing a heavier tax burden on higher value properties. But there have been calls to reconsider some of these measures. Could this plan actually help lower home prices in Korea, and why has it been so controversial?
Well, I think that's right. It's very, very controversial, right? And the key point of the Lee Jae-myung administration's 2026 tax reform plan is to shift the real estate tax system away from the number of properties owned to focusing strictly on property value and actual length of residency. It was, called for a long time. The primary goal of the overhaul is to cool down the red-hot, housing market and stabilize home prices. However, the package, has triggered fierce controversy, because it significantly complicates the tax code and risks unintended consequences for ordinary tenants like us. The plan's, effectiveness in lowering home prices is highly debated, with economists, projecting mixed long-term results. Okay, let's see, think about how it could help, low prices. First one is by penalizing speculative and non-resident buyers. This might, pressure speculative buyers to dump non-owned, occupied unit and increasing housing supply. Secondly, aggressive taxation on luxury estate is designed to deflate the premium on ultra-expensive apartment. Thirdly, the government has suspended capital gains tax surcharges for multi-home owners until 2028. And this, time period will encourage multi-home owners to sell off, excess properties immediately before the heavy holding taxes, take full effect. However, it might fail, to lower prices, because number one is the lock-in effect. Once the temporary capital gain tax relief expires in 2028, the massive tax burden on selling luxury homes will discourage owners from putting their properties on the market. This will choke off supply, potentially forcing luxury real estate prices to even get higher. And secondly, the glided single home trend means, because the owners occupy homes with a market value under 2 billion won and now completely exempt from the tax. Capital, may heavily consolidated in single high-quality residential properties in prime sole locations, and so driving these specific prices up.
Right, and this tax reform plan also includes changes to individual savings accounts or ISAs, as well as legislation aimed at preventing companies from deliberately suppressing their stock prices. And President Lee has now ordered a full review of these measures. So why has the government decided to reconsider them?
Yeah, as you mentioned, President Lee Jae-myung ordered a full review, the proposed individual savings account, what is called the ISA overhaul, and the Stock Price Suppression Prevention Act, right? The abrupt decision followed the intense backlash from, retail investors, financial institutions, and lawmakers, and even individuals. The critics, argue that the ministry's drafted supply policy with severe legal loopholes. The original tax reform plan introduced a new productive finance ISA. It aimed to incentivize the investment in domestic assets by offering higher tax exemptions. However, the proposal contained restrictive clauses that reduce existing financial benefits for small-scale retail investors, such as eliminating overseas ETFs and cutting long-term investment benefits. President Lee criticized, working level, the officers, for failing to understand the sensitivity of policy, beneficiaries, and so that, he say, okay, we need to re-review that. And so that, think about the protecting young investors, right? And then the Stock Price Suppression Prevention Act was originally meant to stop controlling families from artificially driving down their own company stock prices to pay lower inheritance and gift taxes during generational successions. However, experts discovered major functional flaws like excessively narrow scope with a company's price-book ratio and time, and also purpose long-term incentives. So they have to really rethink about our whole policy schemes.
Right. We'll have to see how that goes. All right, Professor Kim, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for coming on this morning. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
In the southern city of Busan, a specialized complex facilitates Korea's supply chain for power semiconductors. Our An Sung-jin is there to see how these companies create a part of the ecosystem.
Korea is a powerhouse for semiconductors, and when people think of the industry, names like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix usually come to mind. Yet behind the country's global competitiveness is a vast network of smaller equipment, components, and materials companies that strengthen domestic chip supply chains. This company, with around 80 employees, specializes in power semiconductors, but it doesn't make the final product just yet. It produces copper clips for power semiconductors that facilitates the efficient flow of both electricity and heat while improving electrical and thermal performance. Based on the design tailored for each customer, these copper molds are printed, inspected, and packaged for export, which take up 90% of their products. Imagine building a house. The power semiconductor is the house itself. Copper clips act like its steel frame. This company makes the steel frame and the specialized construction machine that joins the steel frame together, bonding copper for better stress operation.
In power semiconductors, the choice of materials is critical as it significantly affects performance and final output. The clip material we manufacture is not only used in electric vehicles, but also in NVIDIA's data centers, where we have recently seen significant increase in orders.
Power semiconductors are different from conventional chips. And as demand grows for electric vehicles, renewable energy, and data centers, so does the need for power semiconductors that can operate more efficiently and manage heat. Busan's Power Semiconductor Specialized Complex is the only complex of its kind in Korea. The city is working to build a local ecosystem around power semiconductors, particularly in materials, components, and equipment, as it looks to further broaden the scope of the initiative by expanding programs like training specialized talent.
The Korean semiconductor market has traditionally been dominated by memory semiconductors. However, we can differentiate ourselves as the power semiconductor remains an essential component, and in the long term, our goal is to establish an integrated public-private foundry cluster that can support companies.
And that's why the country continues to strengthen its policy support for the power semiconductor supply chain with initiatives to further enhance competitiveness. The push comes as the global power semiconductor industry enters another period of strong demand. But Korea's competitiveness will depend on more than its biggest chip makers, as the smaller companies supplying the materials, components, and equipment behind them will play an even bigger part. An Sung-jin, Arirang News, Busan.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. Off the coast of Oman, oil from a stranded tanker has spread across almost 400 square kilometers of a protected marine reserve. The Omani government said on Monday that the tanker Caroline Bazenghi ran into trouble in early June and has been stuck near the Halaniyat Islands ever since. It was carrying close to 1 million barrels of Russian crude bound for Asia. Security sources say there were signs that an explosion had damaged the ship. The oil slick now sits within about 7 kilometers of the coast. The Caroline Bazenghi is part of Russia's shadow fleet of aging tankers and is under European sanctions. In the United States, President Donald Trump signed an order on Monday calling for childhood vaccinations to be spread out across separate doctors' visits. The order, which goes against the advice of doctors' groups, asks the health department to offer the measles, mumps, and rubella shot as 3 separate injections. Trump again suggested vaccines may be behind rising autism rates despite decades of studies finding no link between them. The American Academy of Pediatrics says the latest order spreads fear and confusion. Doctors warn that delaying shots leaves children exposed to preventable diseases for longer. In Europe, this summer's heat and drought could wipe out most of the growth the European Union expected this year, according to a report published Saturday by the Dutch bank Triodos. The bank puts the damage at about 1% of the bloc's output, which is worth roughly $208 billion. Most of the figure is due to workers getting less done in the heat. France looks like being the worst hit as repeated heat waves could push its economy into a contraction this year. The European Commission had forecast EU growth of 1.1%. In the United States, jury selection has begun in the murder trial over the killing of rap legend Tupac Shakur 30 years after he was shot in Las Vegas. Prosecutors say 63-year-old Dwayne Davis organized the drive-by shooting. He has pleaded not guilty. Under Nevada law, he can be convicted even if he did not fire the gun. Tupac was 25 years old at the height of his rap career and known for his inspirational lyrics. The case went cold for nearly 3 decades until Davis began talking publicly about being involved in the crime.
Despite the afternoon heat, we can breathe a little easier in the mornings and evenings. Most of the heat wave warnings have been lifted, while a heat advisory has been issued in the capital area and western parts of Korea. And thanks to northeasterly winds, much of Gangwon-do province will stay below 30 degrees Celsius all day today. Most of the country will turn sunny as the day goes on, bringing plenty of strong sunshine, boosting UV levels to very high levels in much of country. So please keep the sunscreen and water bottle close. And this afternoon, Seoul will be getting up to 34 degrees Celsius, Gwangju at 33 degrees, but much of the eastern regions will have much more comfortable temperatures, topping out at 31 degrees in Daegu and Busan, Gyeongju at just 29 degrees. Extreme heat has eased, but we are not out of the woods yet. Afternoon temperatures will remain around 34 degrees Celsius through the weekend here in the capital, with warmer daytime lows, and more rain is expected along the east coast from tomorrow.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.